So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this panel. This is a workshop, so we're hoping that the later parts of it, after we go over some introductory information, will be interactive, and we'll talk about how, but we'd love for you to use the chat, and then when we get to it, we'll also use the raise hand feature, which will allow you to unmute yourself. And so we'll be able to actually have a bit of a conversation, which is what we're really looking forward to. So this is entitled Equity and Access. We're exploring the question of, does your classroom reflect the demographics in your prison? It's a question that we're interested in, and we see you are as well. So today I'm joined by my colleagues. I myself am Ruth Delaney. I'm a program manager with the Vera Institute of Justice. I'm joined by my colleagues Alan Wachendorfer and Kayla James, and of course all of you. So I see Deb Conrad got the jump on this, but to all of you who are in the room, please go ahead and put your name, state, college, agency, and the position that you hold there in the chat so we can get to know who's here, and make sure in that drop-down menu in the chat, select that everybody can see it rather than just the panelists. And Deb, just a tip, you sent that message just to the panelists, and we'd love for other folks to know where you're coming from as well. Great. All right. So today, we've got a couple of different goals. We're going to talk through the landscape of equity in second chance Pell programs, what we understand, what we're seeing in the field, and discuss strategies for equity analysis in post-secondary education programs in prison and in general. Our agenda today is to go over a brief framing of race, equity, and inclusion broadly in post-secondary education based on what we've learned from those that work in that sector of this very large field. We're going to talk about what we've seen in terms of the demographics of students in second chance Pell programs and how we found that information. And then this is going to be the workshop part, is we're going to walk through one way that you might approach doing a self-assessment of equity in access in your program. We're going to talk about the ways to do that, and then we're going to go over a case study using an anonymous college and anonymous state to talk through and brainstorm some of the things that might come up if you do such a thing. And I want to note also that demographic information for post-secondary education programs in prison are not really widely available. So we do have this information from second chance Pell colleges, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be based on that, and we'll talk about how we got that information. So in terms of housekeeping, we do have, when we're talking about these demographic groups and the locations of the programs, there are some language limitations. And by that, I mean, when we're talking about gender in prison, we're really talking about the gender of the facility. So the name or type of the prison that you're held in is kind of the defining factor that we're able to use, because that's the level of data that's collected. So when we're talking about women or women's facilities, we're talking about people held in facilities for women, not necessarily how those individual people might identify themselves, because we do not have access to that information. In addition, there are some issues related to how race and ethnicity is reported in some of our large national data sources. And so, for example, you're going to see Hispanic or Latinx reported alongside white, Black, and a grouping of other racial categories as if it is a race. We understand that that is an ethnic identity, but the way the data is collected and reported does not really recognize that when you're looking at the prison population. And as it turns out, often with the post-secondary population as well. So I also want to recognize that that's a limitation in the way the data is collected. So we'd love for you to use the chat. We're going to keep track of it and make note of questions that you share that you'd like to talk about towards the end. And then, as I mentioned, when we get to the assessment part, we're also going to use the raise hand feature. You can still put your comments in the chat. We'll keep track of that. But we'd like you to use the raise the hand feature so that we can actually hear you and kind of simulate what it might be like if we were in the room together, which I know we would all love to be. All right, so I'm going to talk through and then hand over to my colleagues a little bit more. The kind of race, equity, and inclusion, the way that we talk about this as we've learned in post-secondary education in general. And so this falls into really three buckets. There's equity in access, which relates to ensuring that students in a given college program are representative of the community in which the program is located. There's equity and completion. So once you get that representative group into your college, or really at the bare minimum representative into your college, you're ensuring that people are actually continuing with the program. You're keeping track of dropouts or stopouts, and you're offering services that help people to get to the end of that program. And then the last piece is equity and outcomes, which really relates to people coming out of post-secondary training opportunities or degree programs with the opportunity to earn wages that at the bare minimum are higher than the minimum wage. That is the return on investment that we are looking for from a post-secondary program. And I want to pause there and be really clear that we're not arguing that college be instrumentalized or education be instrumentalized. And in fact, a bachelor's degree of almost any type will meet this requirement in terms of outcome or this goal in terms of wages. Credentials that don't typically earn these higher wages are things like a certified nursing assistant, different kinds of certificates related to childcare or education, sometimes an AA and liberal arts if there is no clear transfer pathway to a bachelor's degree. And so those are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we look at outcomes. And the general recommendation we've gotten from the field is to build your program backwards. So start thinking about the outcomes in terms of the types of opportunities that you want people to have an opportunity or have a chance to be employed in, and then work backwards looking at completions and then looking at access to try to make sure. So how this kind of shows up practically in post-secondary education programs is that we see, and this is something that I think a lot of you who work in Second Chance Pell are quite concerned about, is that students of color often have difficulties enrolling in post-secondary opportunities due to the very high paperwork burden related to completing the FAFSA. So that's an access barrier. In addition, when you get into that completion range, you have issues with pre-credit or developmental courses that really slow progress and they make people feel like they're repeating high school. And that can be a source of feelings of, disinterest and dropping out. Another one can be having a really unclear degree plan or not really being sure, not having a strong advisor that can help you understand how these credits fit together, which can give you a lot of credits that don't really add up to a credential. And when it comes to outcomes, one of the things that we see in the literature is that, and we don't know, again, all of this is related to post-secondary education generally. We don't have this research in relation to college and prison. But one of the things, like when it comes to outcomes, is that we see that students of color tend to concentrate more in low wage opportunity programs like that certified nursing opportunity assistant or the child care sector, while white students are overrepresented in high wage opportunity programs such as engineering, certificates in advanced manufacturing, or the medical and sciences fields. Gender also tends to overlay those things. So there are, differences in the way that people end up in the different types of programs that are available. And so that's another thing to pay attention to when we're talking about that equity and outcomes. And now I will hand it over to my colleague, Kayla, who's going to talk you through, oh, no, I'm not going to do that yet. Thank you, Alan. So the, the great news is, I talked through some of the challenges, but the great news is that there are a lot of people who are thinking about this, many of whom are probably already on your campus brainstorming really great ideas for how to work with students and get them into your programs, through your programs, and into high return kinds of opportunities afterwards. And these are an example, these are a series of examples of some of the ways that this gets done. So doing outreach into high schools, the whole guided pathways approach in community colleges into baccalaureate programs, really focusing on early career and academic advising that connects those ideas, and generally the idea of offering transparency about what kinds of opportunities any given credential track is going to open up to you. We've seen great work on the post-secondary side in prison and after prison related to peer support and mentoring, which is often helpful. There are ways to approach those developmental courses when you still need them. And I won't read everything on this list, but culturally responsive programming is another really important area that has been harder to get to, I think, in relation to, but not it can't be gotten to, but in relation to thinking about the actual texts and materials that you have on your syllabi, and whether they are interesting and representative of the people who you are teaching. Different ways of approaching pedagogy, making sure that you hire and promote faculty of color and give them opportunities as well. And then also, in addition to that career track, there's also undergraduate research opportunities, which I think if any of you participated in the STEM panel yesterday, I believe, we were here, or maybe it was Monday, but we were hearing a lot about that undergraduate research opportunity that they had put together at Princeton for people coming out and going into STEM fields. So that would be an example of that. So now I will hand it over to my colleague, Kayla, who's going to talk us through some of the information that we have gathered from our Second Chance Pell partners related to student demographics.
Thanks, Ruth. So as Ruth mentioned, we're going to talk about Second Chance Pell student demographics. So our next slide shows some of the data on enrollment. So just to let you all know, this data comes from a Vera survey of our Second Chance Pell partners submitted using data from iPads. So the next few slides reflect numbers of students from the first 3 academic years of the Second Chance Pell program, so 2016 to 2019, and later we'll hone in on just the 2019 academic year. So for enrollment, as you can see, enrollment has increased each academic year from the first 3 years of the Second Chance Pell program, with nearly 17,000 students enrolled through Second Chance Pell over the 3 academic years. Our next slide is on credentials offered. So across all of the Second Chance Pell colleges, 73 credentials were offered. 11 of those were bachelor's degrees, 29 were associate's degrees, and 33 were certificates or diplomas. The next slide is on credentials attained. So of those offered, how many credentials were completed amongst the students? As you can see here, the number of credentials also increased as far as attainment goes across the academic years. And you can see that last line is the total number, with most students earning a certificate or diploma, then associate's degrees, and then bachelor's degrees. So these next slides will compare the demographics of the actual students in the Second Chance Pell program as compared to the US college population and the US prison population. When we mention underrepresentation and overrepresentation of these certain groups, we're primarily talking about your Second Chance Pell classroom compared to the prison overall. So this slide is focusing on age, and overall, as compared to the US college population, Second Chance Pell includes more older students, which makes Second Chance Pell's makeup much closer to that of the prison population than of the US college population as it relates to age. But the key takeaway on this slide is that people under 25 are underrepresented among Second Chance Pell students. And that goes back to what Ruth mentioned earlier, that we expect this is because of the paperwork burden that falls on dependent students, such as collecting parental information like their tax returns, which creates a significant barrier for those younger students in prison. The next slide is on facility gender. So again, this takes a look at gender, but a reminder here when we're talking about the Second Chance Pell students, this refers to the facilities where the students are housed. So that's either the men's facilities or the women's facilities. And this data shows that women are actually overrepresented in Second Chance Pell as compared to the US prison population on average. That's that 13% here as it relates to the 7%. However, we do know that there are some states where there's little to no post-secondary education for women. Many states only have one women's facility, which means if there's no post-secondary education there, you may miss the entire women population as it relates to getting education there. And then this next slide is about race ethnicity. So it's looking at the demographics of students disaggregated by race. So the categories that are listed here are white, Black, Latino or Hispanic, and other. So the key takeaways are that Black students are fairly well represented in Second Chance Pell classrooms as it relates to their presence in the prison population nationally. Latinx students and students that fall into a variety of other racial ethnic categories. So this would include Asian, Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, American Indian or Alaskan Native, those who identify as 2 or more races, folks that are foreign born or unknown, that's all that encompasses that other category. Those groups are underrepresented. And you'll also see here, of course, that white students are overrepresented. They make up 50% 12% of the second chance Pell students, which is 20% more than their representation in the prisons overall. They make up 30% of the incarcerated people. So I want to emphasize that these are totals over many jurisdictions. If the demographic data was actually evaluated at the local level, it may show different types of representation. But if you want to learn more about this information, this data is actually included in Vera's policy brief on the first 3 years of Second Chance Pell. So I can drop that link in the chat if you're interested in learning more. And that's it on the demographic information. So I'll pass it over to Alan for the next portion. Thanks.
Thanks, Kayla. So next we want to walk through the first step of an equity in access self-assessment focused on race and ethnicity. So what would a race equity self-assessment include? So earlier we described many of the ways in which you can work towards achieving equity. And therefore a lot can go into an assessment of your program, but we want to walk you through a very simple starting point to look at access. So first and foremost, you want to find out the demographics of the students enrolled in your program, whether that be in a prison or a jail. Next, looking at what are the overall prison or jail system demographics of your state or locality. Look at your college. And then for context too, it's important just to look at what your state looks like overall. So where do I find this information? So in terms of colleges, one of the primary sources of information for demographic data and many other kinds of data really is the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, commonly referred to as IPEDS. This really great source of information. You can find that by Googling IPEDS and it'll actually come right up, but we'll also, we can make these slides available and it's linked here. And so you could just click right on the link and go to it. But so on that website, you can just type in your college in the top left corner and then your college's information comes up and there's all sorts of stuff about, income levels and price, cost of the college. And then there's different demographic data available there as well. The downside is it's not going to show the information that's available about your specific program in your that's in a prison system. For that, you're going to have to go to your institutional research department. If you're administering financial aid, you may be able to go to your financial aid office and get some information from them as well. Or you may be collecting this already as you go through the admissions process. You may have access to that internal program data. As you enroll students, you're sort of collecting that at the front end. But in most cases, folks, you're going to have to go to your institutional research department. And how they'll be able to flag those students differently is in the institutional research department has those students that are in the prison system flagged as being at a satellite location. Just like if you had a different location than your central campus, those students would be flagged in the system differently. That would be true here as well. And they'll show up as, however your administration has flagged them as, whatever prison facility or second chance Pell program, it'll be flagged in that way, and then you can pull down that data. As far as prisons or jails go, really the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Prisoner Statistics Program is one of the best resources for this type of demographic information. They've been collecting this from corrections departments across the country for nearly 100 years. You can go, again, our friend Google can help get you there. If you just type in what I just said, it will come up. But again, it's linked here in these slides. When we share them, you'll be able to find it there as well. And you can find reports as recent as 2019 in there. And I don't think it'll be very long before you'll see 2020 data in there. But it's pretty up to date, and it gets down into different demographic groups based on race and ethnicity and by state. And there's also by gender as well. There's also annual reports that are released by your corrections agency. Now, this isn't always the case, but it is sometimes the case that you can find your Department of Corrections website online, and they'll have their annual reports listed there. Sometimes they're buried, sometimes they don't exist at all, but it's worth checking. Some correction systems are a lot more transparent and have that information readily available. And it gets sometimes a little more granular than that Bureau of Justice Statistics information. So it's worth checking on that as well. VERA's Incarceration Trends Project is another really good source of this type of information, particularly for the jail system. We do annual and actually more often than annual surveys of jails across the country. And it's a really comprehensive website where we have maps, sort of heat maps that you can compare county to county, how incarceration rates are looking compared to other counties. There are fact sheets that you can pull up on your state that compare jail and prison data for your state compared to the states that are surrounding you. It's a really, really great website. So I encourage people to use it. I can't take any credit for it. I did not create that, but I certainly want to brag about it a little bit because it really is a cool website. And then last but not least, the American Community Survey is the most common source for demographic information about our community. So this information is not quite as relevant to this conversation as that prison or jail data is, but it's still important to get a picture of what your state looks like. And if you haven't looked at what your state demographics look like compared to your prison system, you're going to be really shocked and see that it's that people of color are really overrepresented, unfortunately, in the prison system. So the American Community Survey is done on 1 and 5 year intervals in between our decennial census, so that we have pretty up-to-date information about that. A few considerations of some of these have been brought up. You want to take a look at if you want to disaggregate your data in any way. So if you're teaching in a women's facility and a men's facility, you'll probably want to look at those populations separately. Or if you're in, say, a BOP and a state facility, you're going to want to compare your BOP group to the entire BOP system, whereas your state facility, you'll compare that to the entire state, things like that. This has been alluded to earlier, but just to highlight this fact that your prison program may enroll more students of color than your college campus. You may look around your classroom in the prison system and go, wow, it's a lot more diverse than it is on campus. But that's unfortunately because of the overrepresentation of people of color in the prison system itself. So you really want to look around and make sure that your classroom is looking more like the prison system rather than your college classroom or the state itself, which we'll get more into earlier. And then just a reminder once again that this data collection on race and ethnicity is imperfect and can be inconsistent across different data sources. Sometimes this can be overcome by finding data that uses the same definitions, even if those definitions are not ideal, like in our case with using jail or prison versus second chance Pell data for the Hispanic population. That may not be how people are identifying, but at least we know it's the same definition and we can compare those two. And then just one more reminder of this too, this is not anywhere near an in-depth equity analysis, but it can be a starting point for looking for places to dig deeper. So now I want to walk through an actual assessment. This is the part where we really like to get you involved in the conversation. So my colleagues will here and our hosts from the NCHEP conference will keep an eye on the chat and keep an eye on your hands being raised. So if you want to communicate with us through chat, we'll be looking at that. But we'll also want to encourage you to speak up too if you want to just communicate with us that way. So first, I want to describe this slide that we're looking at a little bit, and then we'll jump into a conversation about this slide. So what we're looking at here is a random anonymous second chance Pell College. So, you know, you've looked into all of the information we just described on the last slide with the American Community Survey, the iPads, and your own institutional data on your program. And now you have this information. So what do you do with it? So here on this slide, we have in the middle, I put the Second Chance Pell prison program in the middle so that you could compare it both to the top, which is the prison population in the state overall, and on the bottom, the Second Chance Pell college itself. So not your program, but the college itself that your program comes from. So the numbers you see on the bars represent percentages, so they all add up to 100. The blue represents white students, the red represents Black students, the green represents Hispanic students, purple represents American Indian and Native Alaskan, the turquoise represents Asian, and then the orange is for Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, 2 or more, or unknown. We've sort of lumped those 3 categories into one. So you're looking at this slide, I've described it to you, and you've taken this first step of gathering this information, and now you're comparing to the two. What issues do you see? Again, either share that in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and mention it, that's cool too. So for example, yes, so white people are overrepresented in programs. Good observation. Anything else? Yeah, it does. It's more reflective of the campus and not the prison itself. So Brenda says, I would first ask if Second Chance Pell are in all prisons and if there is a difference between demographics and prisons. Yeah, so you're now, I think Brenda's talking about facility by facility, does it look different, which is very, very likely as well. So that you can put a little deeper on that point as well. You may have some facilities that do have different demographic representation than other facilities. That is very likely.
Yeah, and this is another thing that came up in the chat a little bit earlier too. Those BJS figures, like what we're offering here is a very broad way of doing this, absolutely using kind of available published data. So where you might find more specific individual prison level data would be, you know, if you for some reason can't consult your DOC partner and ask for that information, that would definitely be a good way to get an accurate count. Sometimes the DOC annual reports will include more kind of local level data points like that. But when you look at the BJS reports, what you're going to see is the prison population for the entire state. And that may not, as you're saying, kind of reflect what's happening in an individual facility. So these are always going to be pretty rough using that state level data. Another thing to keep in mind with that as well is that the way that people get sorted when they come into the prison system and go to different facilities, I think maybe this is behind that question also, is like you may see people of color concentrated in one type of facility versus another. If you see white people, for example, qualifying for something like work release in a more regular pattern than people of color, then that work release facility is going to probably be whiter. So absolutely, there's going to be variation. This is kind of a way to do a very rough cut, but I'm not saying that to be defensive. I really do want to get into these questions and the specificity that you're raising.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And Aaron raises a really good point. So what happens if the prison population is mostly white? Does that mean that equitable classroom representation would be mostly white? I think that's a really good question that is worth having a discussion. We definitely don't have time to have the full discussion today, but I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, another question here could also be, you know, we see American Indian, Native Alaskan students sort of overrepresented in the Second Chance Pell program. as compared to the state population itself and the college itself. I don't think anybody here would argue that those students should be removed or not included in the classroom to make it more equitable. And so, really that your program and the people involved really need to have that discussion as what does equity mean?
And I think also, like, in the same kind of thing that I was saying a minute ago, like, because of the way that we may see kind of distributions of racial and ethnic identities that cluster in certain types of facilities, if you come across a facility that is predominantly white, you may want to use the state prison population as your comparison rather than that facility, especially if people are being moved to participate in college programs, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to look at just who's locally at that facility. If there's a possibility that you could have transfers to that location so that people could participate, in which case you really do want to look at the whole state population and think about how to do outreach into those other facilities or start those conversations about how do we get more people that look more like the rest of this prison population here, especially if we only have this one college program. Like, how can we do that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I would just finally add too that there's a reason a lot of us support affirmative action. So Margaret mentions that there are no Hispanic students in the prison program. Good eye.
And one point on that too is that, like, we know that there are issues with how this data gets collected. So one of the things you might use information like this is to ask more questions and to say, like, well, how is this counted? Is it true that there are really no people in this program? Or if you somehow come across a facility that says that there's nobody who's Latinx that's here, you might want to start asking questions about how that group of people is being identified and counted, to make sure that it's not kind of some kind of data oversight.
So I think we've identified many of the problems here. I mean, the other one that's really apparent that but hasn't been mentioned yet, and I want to make sure it gets mentioned, is that the Black population in the program is overrepresented compared to the college itself, but it's extremely underrepresented compared to the prison population itself. So now I'm seeing in the chat we're starting to get into some of my next question is where to start digging in more on this, right? So why are these over or under representations occurring? Is it an access issue, recruitment issue, that kind of stuff? So assuming that these findings are all accurate, what are some strategies that you might consider to address these issues? Well, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit there, sorry. So one person already sort of answered that last question, where do you dig in a little deeper? And we have I think it's
We've got a point here about defaulted student loans and a sense from a college program. I'm sorry, I can't see who put this comment in here for some reason, but that it looks like Black students have more defaulted loans than other students. And so, like, how maybe that's a reason that people aren't getting in. That's a really, really great point. And that's something that you can address. It's not impossible to get someone out of default. It just takes time. So thinking about how to start your recruitment effort maybe earlier, so that people who have defaulted loans can get through that process by the time they're ready to enroll. Or that you have an expectation that you're going to have some people who are interested now but not available for 6 or 9 months until they can really enroll. Another thing we'd really love to see DOC partners doing, if any of you are on the phone, is like thinking about these things when someone enters prison. Like there really isn't at this time much attention to putting someone's financial life in order at that moment. And so there are other things that pile up as well. Including, we've all read, I think, about child support being something that can kind of stack up and cause a lot of difficulties when people are leaving prison, but other things like credit card debt, other things just kind of can hang out there the whole time someone is in prison and has no means to pay. But we've really seen this come about with the student loan default. So we'd love to work with anybody who's interested in thinking about an intake procedure that would actually flag these things and help people get on top of them right at the beginning so that they don't trip people up later.
So someone else here, I'm sorry that cuts the names off. It's not very helpful to tell me that it's all panelists and attendees receiving the message and not tell me the person's name. I think it's Laramie, but I apologize if I got that wrong. I wanted to highlight this one too, because it's a really good point. Students cannot have any Class A write-ups in order to participate in our program. Is there a racial discrepancy in disciplinary data? So this really gets into one of the points we wanted to make sure that came up about the DLC's role in all of this. And if your college requires, clean disciplinary record, or the DLC itself, more than likely it's going to be the DLC itself sort of screening out on that matter. There is definitely disproportionate impact on students of color in this regard.
Kayla, would you like to add anything to that based on your work on our solitary confinement projects?
Yes, definitely. So as Alan mentioned, there's a real role that the disciplinary process might play in this, and how it may relate to DOC's requirements for eligibility, or even things that the colleges have in place. And of course, these are written in DOC policies, so thankfully some of these things can change in policy or in practice. But some questions that you might be thinking about are whether or not eligibility is requirements are excluding certain demographic groups because of their overrepresentation in restrictive housing or solitary confinement. We know largely people of color are overrepresented in solitary, and they might not be able to be in the classroom because of their location. You might also want to think about this as far as it relates to classification. A lot of security threat groups, STGs, or gangs in prisons fall across racial lines. How does eligibility as it relates to your classification as being an affiliate or member of a gang affect the demographic of your classroom? Or any other disciplinary policies that may be disproportionately impacting specific groups. These are all questions that DOCs may need to have with themselves, but colleges may be able to bring up and think critically about how we can create workarounds for these types of issues by reassessing what eligibility requirements we set out.
Thanks, Kayla. And
Yep.
Aaron.
And a great note from Erin in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, a great note from Erin in the chat about LGBTQ folk being disproportionately disciplined. We oftentimes overall see an over-policing of some of these minoritized groups behind bars.
And I think one of the things that you've raised also in talking about the work on disciplinary policies, and we've heard this from others. I think Danny Murillo has talked about this in his own experience, but that there seems to be maybe a trend towards classifying Latinx students as within what sometimes are called power groups or threat groups, or something that really kind of is what we might refer to as a gang identity, and that seems to concentrate among Latinx students in a way that it doesn't with other students. And so when we're seeing a really low proportion of students in Second Chance Pell that like fall into that category, that might be something that's at play as well.
And I don't know if you mentioned this, Kayla, when you were talking about the DLCs. I'm sorry if I missed it, but I just wanted to make sure that it was said, the idea of incentivizing education as well, and how that has an impact on students in terms of,
for sure,
if people are choosing jobs over education, that kind of stuff can cause some of these inequalities. So we've we've hit on a lot of really good points here in terms of like what could be causing these problems.
I do want to address just one thing about the data that Sheila has brought up, pointing out that when we did the survey, we absolutely asked about people getting second chance, that were part of Second Chance Pell, because that was our interest. And now we're kind of looking at it from a different perspective now. And so she points out there could be students that are enrolled not getting Pell Grants that aren't reflected in this data. And that's true, but those students should still be in IPEDS. So if you go in, like once you're using a Pell Grant to pay for anyone in your class, everybody kind of has to be registered using the same mechanism. And so those students should still be enrolled using your satellite location. You should be able to find them in your institutional data and not look just for who's getting a Pell Grant and who's not getting a Pell Grant. but rather kind of just who are all these students. So when you do your own assessment, that is a larger pool that you could look at, that anyone who has that kind of satellite location set up, you could look at all the students, not just the ones that are receiving Pell Grants.
Thanks for adding that, Ruth. So this is definitely not an exhaustive conversation here, but we've touched on a lot of really good points. But I want to get into the next part of the conversation where we want to talk about what are some solutions to this. And so, what are some strategies that you might consider to address not just the access issue, but also looking at completions and outcomes as well? Are there strategies that are being used on the campus that could be used here in your program? What are some of the things that we should be looking at as best practices? And Ruth mentioned some of them earlier, but I just want to make sure that those get brought up again and see if folks have anything to add to those.
Someone, again, I'm sorry I can't see people's names, but just to kick this off, someone did note, how are the GRE programs, or sorry, GED programs, it's written GRE here, but I think you mean GED. Like, how are the high school completion programs working during COVID? Like, is the pipeline of students kind of caught up somewhere? And I think I would expand on that a little bit to point out that people of color are less likely to come into prison having already completed high school. White people are more likely to come in with a high school credential. And so in addition to just, is there a stoppage at the moment? I would think about, how are we recruiting from the high school completion programs? Is there a way to do outreach there that could help someone earlier, before maybe they've even finished that high school credential, be thinking about college as something they want to do in the future? And that might also help to expand the kind of profile of the students that you're recruiting.
Thanks, Ruth. That was on my list of things to make sure got covered, and I was on the back side of the page.
So what else in terms of, like, now you've done a really great job pointing out, I think a couple of people identified also, like, we're only talking about race here. You're totally right. What about the way people affiliate with each other in a religious context? Is that playing out in terms of how people see themselves in or not in the college program? Or, LGBTQ identification, that might be a group that's subject to more strict or disproportionate disciplinary reactions to different kinds of behaviors. And so that could play out in there. Like, this is really just a starting point. And I love that you're kind of pulling us in a lot of different directions already in thinking about all the different ways that these programs can live up to being equitable, and also the ways that we may struggle to do that. So, we talked about recruiting within the GED program. Another thing we've heard from some students is that it can really help. Prison is a highly racializing location. People can end up affiliating only with other people who kind of share their racial or ethnic identity, the same way I think someone was describing with religion. And so thinking about how to recruit within those kind of existing social networks can be a way to also expand who sees themselves as a college student and welcome in your program. So sometimes having someone who's willing to try it, do that outreach and figure out, and usually your DOC folks are going to know these sorts of things. Of how you can kind of get into that social group and say, you are who we're looking for, please come and join our college program. And sometimes having one or two people be that pioneer will help others to see that it's something for them as well.
So I just wanted to make sure folks saw in the chat that Aaron posted a really good IHEP resource for key performance indicators that disaggregates programs can use to begin these equity conversations. So please make sure that you click on that link and grab that before this session ends so that you can check out that resource. Julie mentions that in past classes, we've realized late in the game that a higher percentage of our students, regardless of race, came from middle class backgrounds than the larger prison population. So yeah, there's another thing we need to be looking at too is, you know, other than just race and ethnicity, as Ruth, that gets to Ruth's point. There's all sorts of intersectionalities that we need to make sure that we're looking at in this conversation.
And I think there are great strategies that you could look to, maybe even people on your college campus, about how to, not everybody does this great. As a nation, we don't do this very well, but there are some strategies that seem promising in that area in terms of, if someone's not seeing that college is for them, or they're not, it could be an issue of what you might call college literacy. So you might want to think about how you're explaining your program. What are the ways that you're kind of advertising it to people? Like if people who kind of already come from a background of other people who went to college fits right into their worldview. But other folks may not have that. They may think it's out of reach. They may think it's not for them. They may think, lots of different things. And so what your mission would be is to make sure that they understand it is for them, that you're there for them. And then to back that up, getting into that, like, how do you keep someone in your program through completion? You need those supports to help people get through the program, whether that's extra tutoring, really good academic advising, even if you have to only offer the courses that build to your degree. I know that, like, a student in prison is not typically choosing from thousands of courses on your college campus, but nonetheless, they do need to understand why they're taking this course versus another one, and how it all adds up together into a credential and ideally a career afterwards.
So Alicia, I hope I'm saying your name right, brings up a really good question in the chat about programs having open houses or similar kinds of recruitment events. This gets to Ruth's point about, who's part of the recruitment team, right? If it's a lot of this stuff sometimes is happening through word of mouth or a particular DLC staff person. And so you may not be reaching the entire prison population through those means. And so finding more inclusive ways of recruiting from the larger potential student body is important. And then who is involved in those events too? Do you have former students that have gone through the program? Are there and do they represent a diverse diversity compared to the prison population? That kind of stuff is just really key to starting to bring in more folks into your programs. Yes, and the other point, building relationships with caseworkers if they exist. Those folks have a good outreach and can identify people.
One note on the recruiting events too is that often, and probably most of you are aware of this if you're running a college and prison program, but who gets to show up is going to depend on who ends up on the DOC's call out list for that event. And sometimes those things are defined by a case manager, like, is this person someone we're trying to kind of promote educational opportunities to? Or it may come down to some of those eligibility that Kayla was talking about earlier, related to infractions, tickets, whatever that is called within the disciplinary system in that DOC. So just holding a recruitment event may not get you a new audience. So I think it's important when you're doing that to have real conversations about who's going to be invited to this recruitment. And if we can't get everybody, what are some other strategies? And that might be, how can we recruit through the GED program? How can we recruit through, various other strategies as well?
So we're starting to get short on time, but I wanted to give folks one last opportunity to weigh in and throw out any more ideas that you might have about how to improve some of these issues, whether that be additional recruitment methods or reiterating some of the points that Ruth made earlier about guided pathways or more faculty of color, like those types of points. Does anybody have any final remarks they want to make?
Great. The importance of the messenger, I think that's a great point from Michelle. We have seen some programs recruit using, for example, a piece of one of the several great documentaries we have at this point as a way to kind of like give, especially if the program has not had a college program, the facility has not had a college program before, so you don't really have a student pool to draw on. But to be able to say like, well, here, here, this will give you a little bit of a vision of what this might be like.
Yeah. And Emily's point here about some students having to choose work over education, and then those work schedules being not, those work schedules conflicting with class time, and that having an impact on who ends up in the classroom. Higher education is not considered an institutional job, so that gets back to my point earlier about the roles that DOCs can play here to incentivize education.
We also, I remember, ran into this even in scheduling conflicts, that commissary and the class was happening at the same time. And given that oftentimes people really rely on the food that they can get through commissary to get through the week, that was an incredibly difficult choice for people to make. And so that might be both kind of like the incentivizing, choosing job, but then also there are scheduling issues that some folks may feel more severe, like more of a challenge with than others.
Yep, some other great points in the chat, kind of lumping them together, kind of thinking of who are your champions in some of these facilities. I see the religious volunteers, a lot of chaplains and other volunteers are great to get information out there. CCTV, I see, really thinking about if they're not in the classroom, where else are they in the facility and who is there that could get them this information.
I love the CCTV example. And I know there's some folks in New York working on like an ad for the, and maybe this is similar to what you're talking about, but like an ad for the college that would show in places where anyone who's watching TV would be able to see it.
The college behind bars, showing excerpts of that as a recruitment strategy.
There's also another one that features Hudson Link, which is, the name is escaping me. But yeah, and then I think one puzzle we have not found, a riddle we have not found the answer to think about also is, where is your prison located and where is your college located? And if you're in an extremely rural and white area, you may not have a large number of faculty of color to recruit to teach in your college and prison program. And so that representation in the classroom is going to be more or less challenging depending on kind of what the demographics of your community is and what your faculty on campus look like. And I would also note too, I have heard from some faculty of color in particular that it is a unique and heavy burden to go into a prison to teach as a person of color, very much so as a Black person, because you get treated differently at the gate. The white faculty member, it still often kind of has to go through a little bit of negotiation at that door to be able to bring all the materials in, but this often is ratcheted up for faculty of color. So as you recruit people, there's multiple dynamics to think about there in terms of, you want a classroom that's going to be inviting to your students of color, but you also don't want to kind of like put this extra burden on your faculty of color. And we don't have a great answer to that. And I would love to work on that with any of you who are interested in doing so.
Okay, so we're just about out of time, so I'll have to move us forward through to the end. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. You probably have other meetings to get to or other great conference workshops to get to. So just wanted to announce to everybody that this year Bureau is launching a race, equity, and inclusion initiative within this across the Second Chance Pell sites, and we plan to work with 3 to 4 states and do an analysis, pilot strategies, and monitor those strategies. We'll be able to provide technical assistance around that. But we key to all of that is partnering with higher education experts in race, equity, and inclusion in higher education. Bringing those folks in at the very beginning of this project and working together to address this issue is a key part of our strategy with this project. And our goal is that this will develop more strategies that programs can use. As Second Chance Pell now has doubled, and Pell reinstatement is a couple years down the road. And of course, there are non-Pell funded programs that are out there as well that can use everybody out there can use these strategies. And that's our goal, is to just to build on that body of work. And we'd love to have folks that are interested in participating in this project reach out to us. So that's that. And so as we've been having these conversations, we've come across some good resources and been recommended a few resources and wanted to share those with you. But in these last few minutes here too, we'd love, if you know of something, or if you found something very helpful that's a resource that's not listed here, please throw that in the chat, because we definitely don't know about everything that's out there, and you may have something that we don't know about, and we'd love to hear about it and share that with everyone here.
Yes, someone has already pointed us to another resource, Ben Simon's work, which I'm not sure that we have come across yet, so we'll definitely be looking into that. Yep, as this work develops, we would love to share what we're learning.
Yep. Okay, there's another. So as those resources start to roll into the chat here, we only have a couple minutes left, but if there's any burning questions remaining, we certainly want to open that opportunity up. And sorry we didn't save more time for that, but I think we had a really good dialogue via the chat. So I really appreciate everybody's participation. There's nothing worse than asking a question and then nobody answers, but in this case, it was the opposite, and everybody really was talking a lot and getting involved despite the challenges of technology and all of us not being in a room together. So I can't wait for that too. So next year we plan on seeing you all in person.
I know, we miss you.
Alicia,
yes,
yeah, we can make this entire slide deck available to folks. So however AHEP plans on doing that, I'm sure that we can get that to you, or you can reach out to us individually and get that. Insert thumbs up here, I like it. Thanks, Alicia. Okay.
All right.
Any final thoughts from either of my colleagues here, or I'm all set?
Well, we'd love to hear what resources have been useful to you. I think we've got some suggestions already. And as you can see, we've been trying to learn from kind of other areas of higher education practice and see how they may work in a prison context. I think Jami Sisterhood is doing something similar. It may be the only other group that I'm aware of that has taken the specific lens and tried to kind of bring these fields together. So I'm hoping that more of you will be interested in this, more scholars, more practitioners, more policy-minded folks will start thinking about this issue and on the same idea of like, what can we learn from the field? And, honestly, what doesn't work in this setting? What makes this a unique setting where we might need some unique strategies? But I'm really excited about embarking on, building this part of the field together.
Yep, and we know the larger conversation is happening, and we want to connect folks together. So if there's any folks that you feel are being left out of this conversation that are doing some great work, feel free to share them with us. And hopefully, though this is kind of just a taste of the large undertaking of REI in college and prison work, we know there's a lot to learn from what's already happening in the field, and hopefully we can connect those dots for one another.
And that brings us to a close. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. See you at the rest of the wonderful panels. I won't see your faces, but hopefully I'll recognize your names.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.